Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today to discuss the terrible ongoing humanitarian situation in Sudan and the atrocities that are being perpetrated against innocent civilians there every day, and to discuss measures that the United States and the United States Senate can take to help end the suffering. Since that brutal conflict erupted in April 2023, a staggering 11.8 million people have been displaced within Sudan or fled to neighboring countries. More than half the population, over 25 million people, face acute food insecurity, including 13 million children, and 1 million of them are at risk of or facing famine. While the total casualty numbers have been difficult to determine, a new study from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine's Sudan Research Group estimates that more than 60,000 people died in the Khartoum region alone between April 2023 and June of 2024. That study found that 26,000 people have died as a result of violence, but it also highlights another awful reality, that starvation and disease are increasingly becoming the leading causes of death reported across Sudan. In a hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in May of this year, U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan, Tom Perriello, suggested that the total death toll could be as high as 150,000 people. Mr. President, given the scope and scale of this human suffering, the United States and the international community should be doing everything in our power to end the carnage and end the suffering in Sudan. Toward that end, I want to commend America's Special Envoy to Sudan, Tom Perriello, for his tireless shuttle diplomacy and his ongoing efforts to seek a negotiated agreement to end the conflict that is fueling this crisis. But he can't do it alone, and his job is made much more difficult when other parts of the U.S. government fail to effectively use our leverage to support his efforts. One thing we should not be doing is shipping advanced American weapons to any country that is fueling the misery and suffering and killing in Sudan. And yet, that is what the Biden administration is proposing to do. They are proposing to send weapons to the United Arab Emirates at a time that the UAE is reportedly supplying weapons to a vile and murderous militia group in Sudan, a group called the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF for short. So I'm here on the floor today urging my colleagues to prevent the sale of American weapons to the UAE until and unless the Biden administration provides us, the Senate, the Congress, with credible assurances that the UAE will not, in turn, supply additional weapons to the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan. So let me step back for a moment to put all of this in context. About 3.5 years ago, in May of 2021, I traveled to Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, with my colleague, Senator Coons. At the time, Sudan was experiencing a difficult transition to democracy after a popular revolution in 2019 succeeded in ousting the brutal regime of the dictator Omar Bashir. It wasn't easy, but there was hope for a brighter future. Then, the Sudanese Armed Forces, or the SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, who had backed the popular protests in 2019 and who had helped oust the dictator, Bashir, usurped the newly formed civilian-led government in 2021, and then proceeded to violently suppress mass protests. Following pressure, both from the people of Sudan, but also from the international community to restore the civilian government and merge their forces, instead, a long simmering rivalry between the SAF and the RSF erupted in April 2023, and Sudan descended into chaos and civil war. Now, there's plenty of blame to go around, but one of the many drivers of the collapse of the fragile democracy was the refusal of the Rapid Support Forces, that militia group, to come under the umbrella of the Sudanese armed forces. And Mr. President, the RSF has an especially sinister lineage. They have their roots in the Janjaweed militias that former dictator Bashir used to brutally crush rebellious tribes in the western Darfur region in the early 2000s. I think many who followed those terrible days remember that the United States determined that those mass killings constituted genocide. The current leader of the RSF goes by the name Hamedi. He is a former Janjaweed militia leader who was complicit in those atrocities in Darfur. And he hasn't changed. In the current conflict, the United States has charged the RSF with committing ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. Reputable human rights organizations and news outlets have also reported widespread acts of sexual violence, including rape, by the RSF. As our ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, noted in March of this year, and I quote, "Children are starving, wasting, and dying. Far from their homes and their communities, millions of refugees are praying in overcrowded camps. People in Darfur wake up not to the call of prayer, but to the sound of gunfire, of shelling, of cries for help," unquote. And the situation has not improved since then. Famine has taken hold in Darfur, and the RSF's siege of El Fasher city in Darfur has only exacerbated the already terrible humanitarian situation there. So it should be clear that providing weapons to the RSF is tantamount to aiding and abetting ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. And yet that is what the UAE is reportedly doing. Now, I should make it very clear that the UAE denies that it is arming the RSF. They say they're not doing it. Indeed, when I traveled to the UAE in July of this year, Emirati officials told me that they were not sending weapons to the RSF. And yet, numerous credible reports and sources indicate just the opposite. They reveal that the UAE is, in fact, supplying the murderous RSF militia with weapons that they use to commit atrocities. In January, a UN panel of experts documented what they described as, quote, credible allegations that the UAE was violating the Darfur arms embargo, which was the embargo put in place in 2005 to stop the genocide at that time. Their findings have been corroborated by credible human rights organizations and by an independent investigation by the New York Times, which found that the UAE smuggled weapons to the RSF under the guise of humanitarian aid. The front page story of the New York Times, and I have it here, Mr. President, is entitled, "How a U.S. Ally Uses Aid as a Cover in War." And they go on to point out that the UAE is expanding a covert campaign to back a winner in Sudan's civil war. And they point out that the UAE was smuggling in weapons and deploying drones. Beyond the New York Times independent investigation, the Sudan Conflict Observatory Group, which is a group funded by the State Department, also tracked 32 Emirati flights between June 2023 and May 2024 going into Sudan, and they concluded, and again, this is a group funded by the United States Department of State, they concluded with, quote, near certainty, unquote, that they constituted weapons transfers from the UAE to the RSF. Now, the Biden administration has also acknowledged that the UAE has been supporting the RSF, although you have to read carefully between the lines to determine that. Again, our ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, said, and I quote, "We are aware that both sides are receiving weapons and other support to fuel their efforts to destroy Sudan. And yes, we have engaged with the parties on that, including with our colleagues from the UAE," unquote. So the question is this: if the Biden administration acknowledges that the UAE is arming the RSF against our demands and our interests, and that they are lying about it, why are we, the United States, not doing more to stop it? Mr. President, I understand that we have a very important bilateral relationship with the UAE. They're an important security partner in the Middle East. Major American companies like Microsoft are talking about collaborating on building data centers for advanced AI in the UAE with companies like G42. They may also be cooperating with us on other important American priorities. But that is not a good reason to approve this sale of advanced weapons to the UAE at a time that the UAE is reportedly aiding and abetting ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity in Sudan. That's why I have filed what's known as a joint resolution of disapproval, known by its shorthand JRD, on the Biden administration's request to sell offensive weapons, including rockets and missiles worth $1.2 billion to the United Arab Emirates. In the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs has filed a similar resolution, and both of us have introduced additional legislation on this issue. And I would submit that if any senator is serious about ending the suffering in Sudan, we should not be sending weapons to any country, in this case the UAE, that is arming those engaged in ethnic cleansing there. A lot of senators have talked about the need to focus on ending the humanitarian disaster in Sudan, and they're absolutely right to do so. Many of us have been addressing this and talking about it for a very long time. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee had an important hearing on this matter in May of this year. But colleagues, you don't end the horrific suffering in Sudan by sending weapons to a country that is fueling the conflict in Sudan. That's why I'm asking the Biden administration to provide us, the Senate, the Congress, with assurances that they have received credible commitments that the UAE will not send weapons to the murderous RSF in Sudan. And I would submit that given the fact that the UAE denies that they are engaged in such actions, they should be able to provide assurances that the Biden administration deems credible. And if President Biden believes that those assurances are credible, he should so inform the United States Senate as we consider their request for this arms sale. As Representative Jacobs and I indicated in our letter to President Biden that we sent a short time ago, if we receive those assurances, we will of course take them into account as to how we decide to proceed on the joint resolution of disapproval. I say that because our goal is not to prevent the sale of arms to the UAE. The objective is to ensure that the UAE is not fueling the very crisis and conflict in Sudan that we, the United States, are seeking to end. Indeed, in September of this year, President Biden said, and I quote, "The United States will not abandon our commitment to the people of Sudan, who deserve freedom, peace, and justice. We call on all parties to this conflict to end the violence and refrain from fueling it for the future of Sudan and for all Sudanese people," unquote. I would rephrase that again, and to all people who are fueling it. The Biden administration has rightly put pressure on the RSF by sanctioning several high-level commanders for their atrocities. But it has yet to use the full leverage at its disposal to hold their primary external backer, the UAE, accountable. Indeed, just days after the New York Times story about their independent investigation of UAE arms sales to Sudan broke, the president finalized a major defense partnership with the UAE. And now, as we see, the administration is pushing for a $1 billion plus arms sale to the Emirati government. Mr. President, the title of an op-ed in the Washington Post not that long ago put it bluntly. And I just quote the title of that editorial: "Biden needs to pressure the UAE to help end Sudan's civil war." That's exactly right. And that is what we are calling on the Biden administration to do. I support a mutually beneficial bilateral relationship with the United Arab Emirates. And I am certainly not seeking to permanently end arms sales to that country. But a partnership with the United States needs to account for U.S. interests and values and priorities. And we need to make sure that foreign governments that benefit from a security relationship with the United States understand the importance that we hold on those important issues. So, Mr. President, the bottom line is that the United States should not be sending weapons to the UAE so long as it is aiding and abetting a group that is one of the primary drivers of the humanitarian disaster in Sudan, the RSF, and the RSF that has committed atrocity crimes. That is why the United States should pause offensive arms transfers to the UAE unless and until the Biden administration can provide the United States Congress with assurances that the UAE is not providing and will no longer provide material support that aids and abets the killing spree of the RSF. I hope that the Senate will come together on this important question, and I hope the President and the Biden administration will agree that securing those assurances from the UAE is essential to our goal of achieving peace and stability in Sudan, just as the President indicated we should be doing. Mr. President, thank you, and I yield the floor.